Hi everyone, so I'm Dave Patrick, part of the team working to update Conservation by Design, the Nature Conservancy's guidance for supporting teams in developing or improving conservation strategies. And what we'd like to do in this brief presentation is to first of all introduce you to Conservation by Design, recognizing that for many staff new to the Conservancy, this may not be a familiar term. Once we've gone through that introduction, then we'd like to talk a little bit about how we've updated the guidance, why we've taken the approaches we have, and what are the suite of tools and resources available to teams today to help support you in developing or improving a strategy. And then lastly, I'll just spend a few moments talking about how you can dig deeper if you want to learn more about conservation by design, and critically, how if you or a team you're a part of is looking for support with a strategy, where you can get that support, how you can sign up to take advantage of the resources that we now have available. So I want to begin with the goal of the current work to update the guidance. We have the support of a grant through the Margaret A. Cargill Philanthropies, MACP, to undertake this work. And our goal is fairly straightforward. We want to take the current or the previous version of the guidance, Conservation by Design 2.0, and we want to make sure that we update it to meet the needs of the organization today, to make it more user-friendly, and to take advantage of this opportunity to make sure that the guidance reflects how we want to operate as an organization today as we continue to evolve in our approaches to our work. So let's begin then with the basics of what conservation by design is and what it's for. And conservation by design has gone through a number of different sort of iterations over time, and I'll dig a little deeper on that story here in just a moment. But even as the guidance has evolved and developed, the basic sort of underlying premise of it has remained the same, and that is to provide support to teams in developing and improving their conservation strategies. That has always been the intent, the purpose of conservation by design remains the purpose with the present updated version. So as I mentioned, conservation by design is not new. It has been around for quite some time here at the Conservancy. I love this wonderful figure put together by two of my TNC colleagues, Olivia Millard and Laura Hubbard, who just retired from the Conservancy after many years of service. And in this figure, what you'll see is a timeline running through the center from 1980 to the present day. Below that timeline, in the red boxes, you'll see some of the key advances in how we approach our conservation work, so you can track that evolution. And then above the timeline, you can see in the green boxes how our support, our guidance that we offer to teams in service of having strong strategies has also evolved in concert with how we've changed as an organization. So there's a lot of information on this figure. We'll make sure you have a copy of it if you do want to take a look at all the details. But for today, I'm just going to walk you through a couple of quick highlights. So if you look back to 1980, you'll see that the main tool in our toolbox was our preserve system, land protection, building out our preserve network. And really, that tool has remained an important tool right through to the present day. But what you'll see is that we've added to that toolbox over time. So we had things like eco-regional planning, really expanding our thinking to think about ecologically meaningful scales. We get into our work around whole systems, where we're really beginning to lean into that recognition that people and nature are inextricably intertwined, and that if we want to solve the challenges for nature, we have to understand how people are meeting their most basic needs and how we can support them in meeting those needs in sustainable ways. So then above the line in the green boxes, I want to call out the first version of conservation by design that emerged in 1996. We can fast forward to a really important point in the early 2000s, where many of our partner organizations have been paying attention to conservation by design, were really interested in it. And we had a sort of bifurcation at that point where those partner organizations took conservation by design and molded it into a framework that works for their needs. And that's the open standards for the practice of conservation, which is now the conservation standards. And that work has continued to evolve and grow over time as conservation by design has continued to evolve and grow within the Nature Conservancy. And lots of opportunities for us to learn from one another for cross-pollination, particularly because we have staff and teams at the Conservancy that are deeply invested in the conservation standards and have been part of that engine to carry the evolution of that work forward to the present day. So then we get to 2016, when the previous version of conservation by design came out. Again, that was Conservation by Design 2.0. Lots of key advances in the guidance, but one that I'd really call out is that really leaning in and really integrating people and nature in that guidance. And then we fast forward to the present day, where we're looking to update Conservation by Design 2.0. We have decided to take away the numbers. Our mindset going forward is one of continuous improvement and evolution. So we'll be learning from teams, we'll be updating the guidance based on what we hear from teams. And so having a number doesn't really make sense going forward. So for now, it is just conservation by design, again, without that number. So I want to take a brief tangent here, though, and explain how, a couple of key terms, how I'm using them in this presentation and how they're used in conservation by design. And those are strategy and project. Now, those terms are used in a variety of different ways within our conservation work at the Conservancy, and certainly when we move outside into other key functional areas. So, we're not looking to standardize the use of those terms today, but it is important to understand how we use them in the context of things like conservation by design, and more broadly in our conservation system. And that encompasses things like metrics, the hub, our MEL program, and portfolio management. We try and use these terms in the same way throughout each of those parts of our conservation system. So these definitions are pulled from a glossary available through the Chief Conservation Office on Connect. Let's begin with strategy. So we define strategy as a coherent body of actions that contribute to our 2030 goals. Strategies are defined by a theory of change, and they are then executed through projects. So another way of sort of thinking about strategies is that we've identified, a complex challenge that we'd like to solve in service of our 2030 goals. That's what our teams are doing across the Conservancy. And almost invariably, there are a wide range of different ways that we could tackle those challenges, different actions we could take, a lot of different interested parties that we might engage. And we simply can't do everything. So we have to focus in on what do we think the key actions are that we think are most likely to meaningfully contribute towards the goals of that strategy, our outcomes for that strategy, and ultimately meaningfully advance our 2030 goals. So developing or improving a strategy helps us to figure out essentially what should we do? Who should we engage? How should we engage them in an appropriate and sensitive way? Those are some of the key elements of a strategy. And then we actually take those actions then in the form of projects. So strategies tell us what actions to take. Projects are where we take those actions. They're where we actually make progress towards the outcomes of our strategy. And critically, they're also where we're able to test and learn about some of the key aspects of our strategy, things like the assumptions that are baked into our strategy. We make progress and test our ability to meet key milestones, our intermediate results. So projects and strategies are inextricably intertwined. I also think it's helpful to sort of put conservation by design in the context of sort of all the scales at which we answer a fundamental question that many teams are asking, pretty much all the time, which is what should we do? How should we use our available resources in order to have the most impact towards the things we as an organization care about? And if you think about that question, we sort of ask and answer it in a variety of different ways in our work. So the start of the funnel that helps us narrow down to answering that question are our mission, vision, and values. They help us understand what are we looking to achieve as an organization? How are we looking to achieve that? What do we need to do? We then narrow down from there to our 2030 goals. Our 2030 goals were designed to specifically to help us focus, really to ask ourselves, where can we add the most value as an organization, given what we do well, which is towards tackling climate change, addressing biodiversity loss, and through those actions benefiting people. That really provides a narrowing of the funnel, and the ask of each of us is pretty straightforward. We should put our available resources towards work that we think is going to most meaningfully contribute towards our 2030 goals. But that still leaves us a lot of breadth for answering that question of what should we do? So we can next step down to really thinking about sort of where we are placed within the organization. That could be within a global team. It could be within a local business unit. I'm based here in New Hampshire in the Northeastern United States. We have a business unit in New Hampshire. And so when we're asking that question about how can we most meaningfully contribute to our 2030 goals, we can think about the context within which we work. And that means that there are places, there are sort of scales at which we operate where certain aspects of our 2030 goals, certain metrics, we have 17 metrics that make up those goals. Some of those metrics are going to be more important than others. So for example, to take an easy example, a Mongolia team is clearly not focused on ocean conservation. That's not relevant to their work. Conversely, grassland conservation, working with indigenous people is really front and center. They have a tremendous opportunity to meaningfully advance the metrics that relate to those areas of work. So our teams across the Conservancy should be asking that question, well, what's most relevant for us? Now, I do want to stress that often the most effective way for us to use our resources can be at working at larger scale. So for our team here in New Hampshire, they might actually say, we can make the most difference by working at the scale of the Appalachians, contributing to work at those larger scales. So, important here to recognize this shouldn't encourage parochial thinking, but it really should be an important sort of aspect of narrowing that funnel towards where do we put our available resources. And when we've had those conversations, typically we're at a point where we've identified some key challenges that we're looking to solve. Some key things, again, those kind of thorny challenges, typically complex, where we have to figure out what it is that we should do. And that is where conservation by design comes in helping teams, once you've identified those key challenges, helping teams figure out how best to approach solving them and how to deploy adaptive management so that we can learn and adapt our strategies over time. And it's pretty much unheard of for us to have a strategy exactly play out as we design it in the first place. Some things work, some things don't work, and the world is constantly changing around us. So adaptive management is absolutely critical. And again, we then deploy that strategy in the form of projects, the last point of our hierarchy here. That's where we make progress towards the outcomes of our strategy. That's where we gather the learning to inform adaptive management of our strategy. So that's the basics, sort of the 101 of sort of what conservation by design is about and sort of the basics of strategies and projects. And now what I'd like to do is pivot and talk about how we've updated the previous version of the guidance, the 2016 version, and why we've taken the approaches that we've taken. So we began by, as we began this update process, we began by talking to a lot of staff across the Conservancy. In fact, many of you listening to this presentation were probably part of that outreach. We really wanted to hear sort of, what's been working, what are the challenges you've had with previous versions of the guidance? What other tools and resources are you using? Are you pulling from the conservation standards? We wanted to gather all of that learning so we could really make sure that we kept the best parts of the past, and that, where teams are having challenges, we leant in and tried to address those specific pain points. So that was a starting point for the work to update the guidance. So we learned a lot, as you might imagine, in that discovery process, but I'd like to pull out a few of the key points here that really informed the work to update the guidance. So the first was pretty straightforward. Many teams had looked at Conservation by Design 2.0 and ultimately decided that it wasn't fit for their needs, that it didn't work for them. One of the key reasons for that is that teams using that guidance were often spending over a year, 18 months, developing a strategy while the world changed around them. And that meant sometimes that they get to the point of implementation and their strategy would already be outdated or priorities would have shifted. And as you can imagine, that's deeply frustrating and not a great use of our available resources. So strategy development was just taking too long. We also heard that teams are having to figure out independently how to translate sort of guidance in a text document, in a PDF, into sort of how you actually go through each of the steps. There was a missing piece of the puzzle there, and that teams were looking for tools that could help them take the guidance and translate it into the steps they should go through as a team for any particular point in developing a strategy. We learned that many teams are building from existing work. This is pretty familiar. We've got a lot of work, underway. And it's actually pretty rare for us to be starting a completely new body of work, a completely new strategy. So teams are looking for support with particular aspects of strategies, and they wanted to be able to jump in and work on that particular piece of the puzzle rather than having to sort of wade through guidance that indicated you should always begin at the beginning and go right through to the end of the process. And then the last point here really is a summary of the ones above, which is that the guidance needs to work for teams. We cannot have guidance that is developed by a small number of people and then rolled out without first making sure that it actually works for the teams that it's designed to support. As we went through those conversations, we were also just getting a really good sense of sort of where teams are today when they think about sort of, the completeness, the robustness of their conservation strategies, and whether or not they're sort of in that space of adaptive management, using those strategies to actually, undertake projects and be in that cycle of continuous learning and improvement. And, as you might imagine, what we learned was that it's really variable. We have teams with sort of very new bodies of work where they have yet to develop strategies. We have teams that have been doing work for a long time and they haven't looked at their strategy in many years. And we have teams as sort of the A students where they have a really regular cadence of evaluation, of adaptation of that strategy based on what they're learning through projects. We heard that many teams are undertaking actions without having an overarching strategy. Many of us at the Conservancy are motivated by taking action, by making a difference in the world. And we absolutely need to do that in order to achieve our mission. But simply taking action without being able to assess, are these the right actions to take? Are these the actions that are going to most meaningfully contribute to our goals? Even if we're successful in these actions, can they make enough of a difference to actually, sort of avert the challenge that we're facing? We have to have strategies, and as well as the actions that we're taking, we have to have the strategy project relationship. There are lots of gaps in our use of adaptive management. Adaptive management is hard, and often we develop very sort of grandiose visions for adaptive management that we actually can't practically implement. So we need more practical, pragmatic approaches to getting into that space of adaptive management. And then the last one I think will be familiar to many of you. It's familiar to me as a former conservation director for the Nature Conservancy here in New Hampshire, which is that teams are often too busy to prioritize. The time is sliced too thinly. They've got so much coming at them. It's like a fire hose, but they recognize they need to prioritize in order not to be too busy. There's this vicious feedback loop that can be very, very difficult to get out of if you're working in frontline conservation. So as we updated the guidance, we obviously were looking to take as I mentioned, take the really good stuff from the past, but also to address the challenges that I just outlined. And we did so essentially through two approaches. So the first is that we took the steps in developing a strategy, and those steps are common between Conservation by Design 2.0 and the conservation standards. So you can cross-reference those steps. We took those steps, and for each one, we decided we would build in sort of an individual module. And what that does is it really frees us up to work with teams to figure out what's the most effective, the most efficient way to go through any particular step in the process. We're not locked into a single delivery mechanism like a PDF document. We also need to make sure, obviously, that those modules do fit together so that teams can go through them in whatever order they like and have the outputs from one feed into the next module. But that modular approach was really key to our success as we updated the guidance. It also critically allowed us to test those modules, those tools with teams. And I'll share in a moment here how we undertook that testing process. But that was absolutely key for us to have confidence that these tools do meet the needs of teams across the Conservancy. One of the beauties of sort of where we are today is that we were able to put a lot more resources into building tools, not just sort of updating a text document of that guidance. And that was, we had that opportunity because of two things. One was the grant that was available for us. It meant we could bring resources to this work. But really importantly, we were able to build upon such a rich foundation of existing guidance that have been tried and tested by teams and such an incredible knowledge base here at the Conservancy. So working from that foundation really helped us get into that space of tool development much more quickly. So I want to just mention a little bit more about what I mean by kind of that modular approach. I've introduced that, but I want to dig just a little bit deeper here. So the way that we would go through designing each of those modules is, we had our first sort of high-level discovery where we talked broadly with staff about conservation by design, about strategy development. But when we began each of the modules, what we do is we go back to staff and say, okay, if you've gone through, say, a situation analysis, how have you approached that? What tools did you use? What worked well for you? What would you, what were some of the common pain points? So we gathered that sort of information at the level of each of the steps in developing a strategy. And from that, we were able to define sort of a problem statement. And that essentially said, this is what you need to achieve through this strategy. And again, that was based on what teams were telling us and what the existing guidance told us. And these are some of the common challenges that teams are encountering as they go through those steps. So that was the problem that we looked to solve then through an initial prototype. And that prototype was the simplest tool, simplest guidance we could think of. And the idea then is that we would test that prototype with the first team. They'd give us feedback. They'd tell us what worked, what didn't work. We'd make changes, and we'd only add complexity if teams indicated that complexity was needed. So by the time we'd gone through test after test after test, we got to a point with each of our modules where teams were telling us that, yeah, this actually works pretty well. This meets our needs, and it is a good balance of efficiency and efficacy. Internal to our team, we call that version 1.0. That's not the term we use across the Conservancy. But basically, when you look at our modules today, you can have confidence that they've gone through that testing process to the point where teams are telling us that, yes, these tools work for those teams. As we were going through developing the modules, we were keeping in mind some key design principles that you can see in the slide here below. We wanted our modules to be simple as possible. We wanted them to be accessible, and we wanted them to be effective. We wanted to make sure that the modules worked for teams across a wide range of sort of strategy development kind of places. So, teams with newer work, teams with mature work, we wanted to make sure that our modules added value to each of those teams. We wanted to maintain and increase that focus on our 2030 goals through the modules to really support teams in thinking about how can they most meaningfully contribute to the 2030 goals. And we had some key design principles that were through lines, that were interwoven through all of our modules. And those are equity, so making sure that our guidance helps teams advance equity in our conservation work, continuing and strengthening our use of evidence as we make decisions, and then continuing to focus on impact. Really, how much of a difference is this work likely to make? So we were trying to strike a balance as we developed these modules, and we were aiming for something that sounds totally underwhelming, which is that teams coming out of a module had got to sort of a good enough place. And recognizing that for many teams, you can only get so far in sort of a planning step before you need to get out in the world and testing. So for many teams, they were going to be going into a space of adaptive management, learning, and iteration. And part of our thinking here that was really reinforced when we tested with teams is a recognition that you have to learn through doing. That there's only so far that sort of strategy planning, sitting with a virtual whiteboard or a chalkboard in front of you can actually get you before you need to get out in the world and test some of your ideas and learn from what actually happens. And so we have in the past often spent far too long developing strategies and far too little time testing, learning, and adaptively managing those strategies. So we're trying to strike a balance with our modules here in that space. So we have 9 modules that are under development, 8 of which have reached that point where they're being released across the organization. The 9th, our integrating equity module, that's a brand new module where we didn't have a foundation to build from, and that one is getting close to the finishing line. I'm not going to step you through all 9 of these modules now just to save time, but as I'll share at the end, we have all of the resources for each of these modules available on Connect. It's super accessible. So if you want to learn more about what the modules are, dig a little bit deeper, I can point you towards those resources here at the end. I do also really want to emphasize that this has truly been a one conservancy effort. When you look at this guidance, remember that over 500 staff have provided input on this guidance, have helped us test and improve those tools. And so this, I hope this really feels like the Nature Conservancy's version of the guidance, rather than guidance developed by 2 or 3 people working in the center of the organization. I also want to emphasize that using modules can be a little bit daunting. Any of you that have actually sort of taken a look at these modules, generally the first impression is, whoa, there's a lot of information here. And the analogy I like to use here, which I think certainly makes sense here in the United States, is flat packed furniture. So often when you buy furniture from a large store, it comes in a box and you have to assemble it yourself. And when you go open that box, you can find everything from a single sheet of paper that says, okay, build this chest of drawers. You need a wrench, good luck, right through to a 15-page manual that gives you a step-by-step guidance. It gives you a lot more confidence that when you get to the end, you're going to have a functioning chest of drawers. We have aimed far more towards guidance that is at sort of that end of the spectrum, where we have we have steps, we have specific guidance that's being tested with teams that gives teams a lot more confidence that if they follow the guidance, if they follow those steps, if they use the tools as designed, they are going to end up with a useful output, that good enough product at the end of the process. And one of the reasons we put the time into developing this more, sort of stepwise guidance is that it really democratizes teams taking advantage of this support. So we have some incredibly talented, knowledgeable facilitators across the Conservancy, our conservation coaches. And if you're able to access the resources of a conservation coach, they will really be able to help you in developing your strategy. But it takes years, decades to gain the experience that our coaches have, and we simply don't have enough coaches to meet the needs of all of our teams. So our hope is that our modular approach, the approach we've used to develop these tools, makes it a lot easier both for the teams and for the facilitators of those tools to work together to go through each of those steps. So I do briefly want to talk about how we have approached building capacity. What we learned through testing is that for many of these modules, having somebody trained as a facilitator is needed. And we learned that from the teams themselves. That's what they told us that they would need. And so we've been looking to build out a network of trained facilitators across the Conservancy. And our goal initially is to build out our first cohort where we have facilitators trained in each of the modules available in each of our regional or global teams. And we work with the regional and global teams to figure out who should we train, so where would they need to be in the hierarchy in order to support teams within sort of the region, the global team, in using our modules. And we now have 90 staffs, signed up for trainings. We've been going through trainings, and many of those facilitators are now trained in using these modules. As we've been doing that, we've been striving to find the most effective and scalable approach to training. Our facilitators are busy. We want to minimize the ask of them in getting trained in using the modules. And we recognize they're going to probably want more support after initial training. So we've been talking with those trainees around, well, what might that support look like? And as we go forward, we'll be testing some of those models. We'll be iterating, or we'll be learning how to most effectively support our facilitators, as well as the teams that are actually using these tools. So my last slide here is if you're still with me, is where you can find out more information. We have a fantastic Connect site that's recently been updated where all of the information about our modules is available, really accessible. There's some great videos if you want a quick primer on conservation by design, lots of great resources available through Connect. And soon we'll have a new website where all of that information is housed. And once that website's ready, we will be sharing that with folks across the Conservancy. If you are interested in actually going through one of these modules once you've learned a little bit more, please go ahead and fill out our intake form. Once you've done that, we'll reach out to you, we'll set you up with a facilitator, and we'll make sure you get the support to use these tools. So thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it. Thank you for your interest in conservation by design, and we are here to support you as you go forward.